latest stop on my journey through the works of H.G. Wells brings me to 1901 and a short story titled A Dream of Armageddon. I need to set a little bit of the stage historically for this story because there are a couple of interesting things that happen in this story, a couple of interesting prophecies in this story, but they're not that big a deal when you know the history of what was going on in the world at that time. In 1901, even though World War I was quite a few years off in the future, there were still tensions between England and Germany, which did lead quite a few authors to write stories and books speculating about a big war between England and Germany breaking out, such as the Battle of Dorking is a famous contemporary novel, which is all about a war breaking out between England and Germany around this time. And so it's not ridiculous for H.G. Wells to prophesy a big war. But the interesting thing about the war that Wells writes about in this particular story is that it's not just a big war, and it's not specifically between England and Germany. He writes about a world war, a global war that affects all the way down to the island of Capri, where the main characters are staying and are caught up in the war. And in particular, he speculates about this world war being started by somebody who is a little crazy and has the goal of world domination and uses technology, particularly air warfare, to achieve his goals of dominating the world. And so a war breaks out all over Europe, at least. We assume from the title Armageddon that it breaks out over the whole world, but it's at least all over Europe, from England all the way down to the Mediterranean. And there is a lot of air warfare going on. Now remember, this is 1901. The Wright brothers still have not made their historic flight. But in 1901, and of course, this follows When the Sleeper Wakes, where H.G. Wells first wrote about major air warfare. But in this one, he talks specifically about planes with wings and propellers, which is exactly what eventually came to be. So Wells seems to have prophesied World War II, not really World War I, but World War II in A Dream of Armageddon. Now, the story is written in the form of a man in 1901 who is having dreams about the future. But he says these dreams seem more real than ordinary dreams. He feels like he really did live in the future, and he even says how he feels like his life in England in 1901 feels dreamlike, and it's this future, an undetermined amount of time in the future that feels like the reality. And he remembers details, such as realistic details about Capri, a place he says he had never ever visited, except in his dreams. And the person he's relating his story to had been to Capri and can confirm, yes, that is Capri. That is what it's like. So it's a very interesting story. It has that Wellsian, what's the word I'm looking for? That sense of the mystery, that sense of things not being quite what they seem, that kind of unreality or surreality that you come across so often in Wells fiction, which he achieves by having the story be from the standpoint of somebody who's listening to somebody else who had some kind of extraordinary things happen to him. And so there's this sense of madness to the stories. There's this sense of unreality or surreality that, and often a sense of, in other stories, a sense of horror, a sense of doom that comes across beautifully in his writing. Comes across so well in his writing, so strongly in his writing. Now this one, it's hard for me to say if there's really a deep philosophical point here. There seems to be a point being made about the difference between our everyday lives and loves and hopes and dreams and the reality of history sweeping us along, sometimes sweeping us under the carpet, which really did come to pass in World War I and World War II, with a lot of innocent people being killed by these, this machinery of these nations serving their political goals, serving their political ends that has nothing to do with these innocent people just living their lives and, working wherever they work, in a farm or at a shop or something, and being caught up and being killed by it. Their lives are turned upside down and totally destroyed. And everything that they live for, everything that they hope for, and everything that they love gets destroyed with it, just because they get in the war of the political machinery behind a big war like World War I or World War II. And that really did happen in World War I and World War II, where a lot of innocent people were swept up in it and lost their lives through no fault of their own, except standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's what happens to the characters in this story. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Except that the main character seems to escape death by it being all a dream. Or was it? Maybe both realities existed. Maybe somehow he crossed time. We don't know. It really isn't explained. And it doesn't need to be explained. That's not the point of the story. Wells was trying to make a point about war and about our lives and about how history does sweep individual lives into it and carry it along with whatever is happening in history. Now, you got to remember, Wells had a brilliant mind for history. He wrote an important book, an important overall book called The Outline of History, which for many years was the standard for that kind of telling the history of the whole world type of book. And so history was very important to Wells's thinking and Wells' imagination. And so making that point in this story was an important part of the Wellsian philosophy. And so this becomes an important story. Now, there's a later novel written about 1923, which I've yet to read. I've never read it. It's just called The Dream. And I just kind of went and read a little bit of the synopsis of that novel and a tiny bit of the Brian Aldiss introduction in my copy of The Dream. And The Dream is about a guy who lived in the future but came back to the present and is living in 1920s England. But that book seems to be more about that person's perception of what the world is like in 1923 than talking about what the future could be or global warfare or anything like that. So it seems to be a different story, but it seems to be in some ways the same idea, the same story, just with a little bit different goal. Like Wells took a Dream of Armageddon and looked at it and said, okay, I've talked about the future, but if this person did somehow come back to the present day from the future, what would he think about our world? And so then that spawned this whole other novel in the 1920s. Interesting story. Definitely one of Wells's best stories. And I'm going to put it on the telltale list of the greatest stories. I know I have a lot of H.G. Wells on there already, but that's mainly because that's what I've been reading for the last 5 years is H.G. Wells. with other things in between, but I keep going back and reading more H.G. Wells. Now I've got a couple more short stories in front of me, and then I get to The First Men in the Moon. I don't know if I'll do reviews of the other short stories. I'm definitely going to do a video review of The First Men in the Moon, so come back for that. That's all I have for this one. See you next time. Like us, subscribe to us, share with your friends, post comments about this. Do you think I'm on drugs in what I'm talking about? Do you think I'm right on in what I'm talking about? Are there little details you know about this story that I don't know? Share it with us. Engage with us. This is to get all of you talking about books. Not just for me to sit here and talk, but for you to also get involved and talk about books. Talk about other books if you've never read this story or never read anything by H.G. Wells. But if you never read anything by H.G. Wells, give him a shot. Go out there and get The Time Machine or The Island of Dr. Moreau and read it. They're great. It's great stuff. Even though it's more than 100 years old, it's really excellent literature. He's one of the best writers, and he is, of course, the first modern science fiction writer. He forged the science fiction as we understand it today. Not Jules Verne, not Mary Shelley, not Edgar Allan Poe. Nobody else really wrote about the impact of science on the world like H.G. Wells did. And this story is one more example of that, seeing how our science could lead to such a huge war like World War II. And of course, it did. So we aren't the first ones to feel like we're living in a science fiction story. When H.G. Wells, when World War I broke out and World War II broke out, Wells must have sat there and thought, man, I wrote about this. And here it is, He was dealing with that feeling back in his day. So we're not the only ones. We're not alone in that. And our world, from now and into the future, in good ways and bad ways, will continue to be transformed by our science and our technology. You can count on that. And hopefully, great writers will continue to see great possibilities for stories in the things that happen in the future. Okay, now I'm done. Bye.